Well, I was asked about 3.5 weeks ago is to start looking into the topic of identity and belonging and whether or not it's a topic for European youth policy. You remember from previous versions of the program that Professor Howard Williamson was supposed to be here and then couldn't make it. And it's a little bit mad that I agreed to do this because 3 weeks is not a lot of time to do something that you actually haven't done by the time you agreed to, give this presentation. So we haven't done any substantive research on this yet and started looking into this topic, which had been one of curiosity for us, for our think tank Youth Policy Labs, literally 3 weeks ago. And so take everything that you see today with that in mind. This is a big construction site, but it is something that we were deeply curious about for a long time and then just jumped on the opportunity provided to us by the OFFENBURG Talks. And now enjoy the rain. Ooh, what a sound. This is a very dramatic underlining for my talk. It's not as gloomy as the city of Offenburg may suggest to you at the moment. It's also not all shiny as the weather of the past day and a half. So my colleague Ole and I, we looked into this over the past 3 weeks. Before I show you what we could dig up in the little time that we had is just a quick reminder that in youth work and youth policy making and non-formal education, we very often work with models around identity and senses of belonging. The one that we probably most famously work with is the one of the onion, right? You have layers, and there is a core. Another one that I quite enjoy working with personally is the one of the avocado. You have something identifiable, hardcore at the center. Then you have a lot of things that you can't quite distinguish in the middle. And then you have something that holds it all together on the outside. There is also a model around mushrooms. I'm not kidding you. Because mushrooms, in most countries and most regions, you don't rip them out, you cut them off, right? So every year they grow again. So parts of identities can't quite distinguish, they always return. That's the idea of this model. You also have a model around eggs, right? That they may look to you like they're the same from the outside, but then the moment you open them up, they are very different and distinct on the inside. But what I want us to keep in mind in particular now as we come to the end of this is that all these models are, of course, shortcomings of the complexity of life, right? Identity is not easy and nice. Senses of belonging are not easy and straightforward. The moment you do something with any of these models in real life, right, it's like an omelette. I mean, you put these things together, you stir them, and who are you then to identify that this sense of belonging actually belongs to Europe, or this part of your identity is part of what is the core of your identity? And then anyway, these things shift and change over time. So just to keep this in mind, models simplify, reality is complex, and that is something that will also be reflected in what I'm going to show you. So the first thing that we did is we asked ourselves, do these topics of identity and belonging, do they already appear sort of in the guiding framework documents that we have at European level for youth policy? So with apologies to the partnership, we looked, of course, at the youth policy essentials. Nothing about identity and nothing about belonging in them yet at this moment, right? They iterate, they evolve. So at the moment, we don't have anything in them. So we asked ourselves, has it made, have these topics made it into at least the reference manual for youth policy from European perspective that has recently been overhauled? And I am very happy to confirm and also underline, hopefully. In any case, so at the moment, we have very little to guide youth policy development and youth policy implementation around these themes. But then what we wanted to know is, right? Acknowledging, for the time being at least, identity, belonging essentially absent in our own manuals for the field, right? And not a blame, just a statement and observation. Is it absent as well in national youth policies? So 3 weeks ago, we still had the ambition to look at 27 national youth policies and see whether we can find, anything about census and of belonging identity in them. Reality, well, models are simple, reality is complex. Reality then told us, maybe try to do it with 12 for the time being. And because you really dig for the needle in the hay, as they maybe don't say in English. But in any case, you know what I mean? It's very often just fleeting references to the topic in national youth policy and national youth strategy and national youth program documents. And so it took us much longer than we originally thought to figure this out. So there are a couple of ways in which identity appears as a topic in national youth policy making in those 12 countries that we looked at we worked ourselves a little bit around. We started in the Baltic countries. We looked at some of the Nordic countries. We looked at Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Greece. We looked at a couple of countries on the Balkans, Croatia and Slovenia, I think, and just took a little bit of a sample without really knowing how to construct the sample because there was no previous knowledge about how strong or weak identity appears in each of these. So one way in which identity appears is through and connected with the topic of participation. So here's one example from the National Youth Programme of Croatia, right, where it says the active participation of young people will directly contribute to building their identity and make them aware of the importance of taking responsibility. And you have that in a couple of the others of the 12 that we looked at. And I would not be surprised to find out later, in a few weeks or months from now, that this is a common pattern across all 27 or all 46 national youth policies of the European Union and or the Council of Europe, that participation is understood as a construct, a vehicle, an approach to building and constructing identities of young people. So that's one example of how that's being phrased and being done. Here's another one from Latvia: increased civic participation of young people, including the involvement of young people in solving issues in all sorts of different ways, strengthen their sense of belonging of young people to Latvia and to Europe. Also quite a common appearance that the country in question and Europe is mentioned both in the national youth policy nowadays. So that's one. But then the problem that comes really with that is that actually participation is supposed to be a human right. It's not supposed to be a means to an end, however noble it is. So that is definitely something that we have to start doing in policy making to decouple these things. And it's of course totally fine if participation also leads to the constructions of identities, to strengthened senses of belonging. But that's not what participation should be introduced for in national youth policies. Then very often we have seen identity through culture, right? Again, two examples, one from Norway, knowledge of and experience of our shared cultural heritage strengthen the sense of identity and belonging to the various communities of our society. It is an overarching goal for our policy to contribute to ensure that everyone can have access to high quality art and culture. And the second example is from Czechia, which is one of the national youth policies. You may have seen this maybe most prominently from Estonia, that doesn't work with like narrative text anymore, but quite down to business with like dunk, 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 with lists and stuff like that. So this is not us, but that comes from the national youth policy itself. So there's a couple of goals and then sub-goals and goals and actions. So one of the sub-goals is facilitate the inclusion of children and young people. And then they have one goal: encourage the development of skills for children and youth to promote tolerance across cultural and social groups. And then they have one action that says support activities leading to a sense of identity, culture, traditions, and language. They don't say which language, which culture, which tradition. So that's another part of the problem. But what we see across the 12 documents that we looked at is that culture is fairly often limited to heritage, to preservation. right? We want to preserve what we consider is the core of our national culture. So a very limited understanding of culture and therefore by extension also the idea of identity. Then another quite regular feature is identity through inclusion, right? Here an example from Estonia, where it says in the National Youth Sector Development Plan, how young people perceive their inclusion and their sense of belonging depends on whether they are heard, whether they are responded to, whether they have a sense of belonging with their peers, whether they are included in meaningful activities within their community. Quite a progressive understanding, also probably the most progressive and comprehensive youth strategy that we have in Europe at the moment. And then in Spain, the youth strategy has a different take on it, where they say in the strategy document that all youth, especially if they were part of family with children or belonging to disadvantaged youth groups, became de facto discriminated by our socioeconomic system. Quite a bold statement to make in the National Youth Strategy. And then they say the right of young people to choose and forge their own identity, the protection of their own image will always be favored or will always be protected. If you have seen the youth strategy of Spain, it's like a 180-page document. It's very long and lots of narration in it. So that's like, a quarter of a page among 180 of them, how much that really plays a role in actual policy implementation is a question I can't answer at the moment. But there we go. So there is nothing yet that we have seen with the 12 so far to pick up on what we've heard yesterday around conflicting identities, around how to resolve them, around how to help young people to potentially resolve them and reconcile them. Nothing about that, at least not yet, not at the level of nuance. Then there's quite a bit in national youth policies around the sense of belonging through youth work. Right? So again, two examples, again from Estonia. The quality of youth work is based on systematic and conscious planning of activities as experiences of belonging. Right? Quite a rare take in what we have seen. But then they also say that activities organized in youth centers guide young people and support their search for their identity. Right, so quite a clear picture on that. And also in part of the Estonian youth work education, questions of identity, senses of belonging, multiple identities, European identity, and how to reconcile it with an Estonian one or a regional one, actually has been introduced as a topic of teaching to youth workers. To the extent that I'm aware of, the only country where that is already the case. And then you have Lithuania, where together with Latvia, it's the only country among the 12 at least that we have looked at in depth, where they speak very clearly also about culture and preservation of identity in relation to their diaspora. And where they say a part of the role of youth work is to work with young people, with Lithuanian and Latvian young people living abroad, to help them not to forget their own culture and their own identity, essentially. Right, which we thought was quite a unique take. So that's from National Youth Policy Action Plan of Lithuania, which has just been published a couple of weeks ago. But beyond these general statements, the role of youth work in relation to identity building, formation of senses of belonging, strengthening, working with these is largely unexplored at least at policy level, right? And then something that has started to appear very recently, which we would say probably quite a good development, is that youth policies also start to acknowledge the roles of youth cultures and what they can do and do for the development of young people's identities and senses of belonging. So the National Youth Strategy of Germany is very explicit and clear about that and says culture creates identity, creates community. Culture can connect generations, enable young people to participate in society regardless of gender, age, origin, religion, education, and income. And then they say different youth cultures have a special role. because with and through youth cultural affiliations, young people can try things out, invent their own creative forms of their attitude to life, and set themselves apart visibly for society. Right? So the acknowledgement that it's fine and it's supported by and acknowledged at policy level that young people want to be different and express that difference also visually is quite unique. And the second example, again from Norway, where it says the cultural policy, so they have one policy that they call for culture and youth. Cultural policy should contribute to giving children and young people opportunities to participate in and experience a diverse cultural life. And the government will ensure that they have the opportunity to do so and invest in, among other things, in areas such as bands, choirs, and youth cultures. And they also do in practice. And again, you know, this quite unique take at the moment that youth cultures play a role and should be acknowledged and supported through youth policy, youth work, and youth programming. And we were quite surprised to see that. I mean, we knew it about the German national youth policy, but we had no idea that, you know, it also appeared elsewhere. So who would have thought? And then we did, then the second part of what we wanted to do in preparation for today was not only to look at originally 27, then 12 national youth policies, but is also to try and work with a new data set that has only been published really, I think, a week before we started talking even, to look at what we can potentially learn about identities of young people from data that is available, but that we don't typically use in the youth field. So what has been published just a couple of weeks ago, now in 2002, is something called the Integrated Values Survey, IVS. And maybe you know either the European Values Study or the World Values Survey. They are two of the biggest global and continental surveys that are repeatedly implemented in countries that participated in them. Right? Most European countries participate in one or the other, many in both. They are implemented in waves. So the World Value Survey has been implemented in 7 survey waves that roughly happen every 5 years, unless there's a pandemic involved. And the European Value Study has been implemented in 5 survey waves. They are much further apart, 9 to 10 years. And over time, the research community started integrating the questionnaires, right, and making sure that the way they ask about different parts of identities, different sense of belonging, became equivalent, so they could start comparing. And so what they have done over the past 3 or 4 years, really quite a difficult and tedious process, is they joined these 2 data sets and built one integrated values survey data set that covers the 40-year period from 1981 to 2021, when the last surveys were made for the World Value Survey. You can find more about it online, not much yet, but in any case, so we got our hands on the data set, which originally has 645,000 or so respondents, also has 838 variables, all of them centered around values and how they change over time. So there's really quite a substantive body of evidence waiting for us there. So what we did is we built an integrated values survey European youth data set, right? We kicked out everyone who was not at the time of their response based in one of the 46 member states of the Council of Europe, and we kicked out everyone who was under 30. Right? The limit of this data set is they don't survey young people under the age of 18, which is quite relevant to do for youth work and youth policy development, also quite hard to do, which is why most of the international and global surveys don't even attempt, right? Having to navigate the legal situation around surveying minors in 55 countries at the same time is a challenge they understandably shy away from. Sad for us, but you know, there we go. So we now have a data set with 71,543 respondents, which are all young people under the age of 30 in one of the 46 European member states. And so we just started poking a little, right? Exploring. And some of these explorations I have brought with me. So one of the things that we very often hear is that family is not as important for young people as it is for older people. was never true, right? And there's lots of research to put it on. And this is just one other piece. It's never true. Hopefully it's never going to be true. This is, you see here the different age groups, 18 to 20, 21 to 23, 24, 26, 27 to 29, these clusters that we have built ourselves. And then you see how they developed, how the importance of family, with a question that has 4 responses, right? It's a Likert scale, so very important, important, somewhat important, not important. And we only show you here very important, right, the very top. And you see it hovers somewhere between 80 and 85% or so, right? And changes a little bit over time, but that's how you, and that's not different from older people, right? There is no difference. Where there is a difference, however, is the importance of friends. Right? Friends are more important for young people than they are for older ones. But you see, considerably less important, right? The scale here is the same, starts at 0, goes to 100. Now look at where the family hangs, up there at 80, and then look at where friends hang, right? So there is actually a considerable difference for the average responding young person. The moment you start looking at migration backgrounds, you start looking at urban-rural disaggregations, you start looking at gender differences. I'm sure that will look different. Nothing we could do in the time that we had would be important to do. But sort of as a general picture, what we often hear in dialogue with policymakers, friends are so important, family is not important enough. It's not true, it's never been true. Then interest in politics, another one. So the scale here is different, starts at 0, goes up to 25, just so you see the nuances between the age groups and over time a little better. Interest in politics, again, 4 answers on a scale, very interested, interested, somewhat interested, not interested, and we again only show very interested, right? And again, this is something where young people do not differ from the rest of the population. It's roughly the same level of very strong interest in politics. And it makes no difference how you combine the answers. You could look at all positive ones, right, the 3. You could look at the not interested in politics at all. There is no stark difference between young people and sort of the rest of the population. One question in which these value surveys try to explore issues of belonging, issues of identity is also how confident respondents are in different parts of the democratic system. So I have here listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They have a battery question that asks about 16 or so, right? But I've picked the first 9. And if you think I'm insane and can't spell or whatever, they are just listed in the response order in which they're in the surveys. I don't know why they're not alphabetical. So I have a question for you at each table, right? When you look at these 9, which do you think were in the last survey round, which happened between 2017 and 2021, field work mostly before people realized what this pandemic would mean for their lives, right? So factor the pandemic largely out of your thinking. What do you think were the top 4 institutions young people trusted the most in this last survey round? You talk at your tables, you give me your top 4, and then I show you whether you're right or wrong. Good luck. All right, let's hear it. Claudius, take a mic.
So we are sure that it is police, justice system, education system, and environmental protection movement.
All right, let's hear the others.
I can make this very short. We had the exact same answers.
Really?
We really had education system, police, justice system, and environmental protection movement.
All right. What, did you pick anything at your table?
For us, it's the environmental protection movement, education, press, and justice.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but for you it is?
So we didn't finish actually. It's definitely, we all think that it was environmental protection movement and education system maybe. I was thinking at least. Then other people thought that the justice system, I wasn't very sure about. I was also offering European Union. I don't know, and police, police. So that so basically we couldn't agree.
Okay. How about your table?
Okay. We guess the number one would be the education system, justice system, and we thought the trust in government and the police will be correlated as the third and fourth.
Okay. And did you come? That's fine, Matti.
I like Slovenia. I'm only one, but have the full voice. Environment, police, justice, and government.
I was a little bit shocked. I was like, did they sneak peek into my presentation over here? Because you got it almost right. So the first is the police. Then comes the education system, then comes the justice system, then comes the environmental protection movement. And I'll show you how it developed over time. I apologize, I didn't have enough time to make this look decent. But so here you see a little bit. So the education system is the blue graph, the one there at the top. And it has not been surveyed in all survey rounds. That's why the graph is interrupted. But you see there at the very end, sort of the dot at the 15%. And again, remember, a great deal of confidence, right? Likert scale for answers, great deal, fairly confident, somewhat confident, not confident, right? So 3 positive responses, 1 fully negative one. And this is only the top positive response. So doesn't necessarily say that 75% of the people, of young people, misjudge the justice system, but who have a great deal of confidence in them. That's what this graph shows. The police has gone up like crazy between the past 2 survey rounds. I mean, your speculation as well as mine. Why? And then you see the justice system has done quite a good catch up there. The brown graph. And then the environmental protection movement has gone through a little bit of up and down, the orange graph there. And then the others follow. What I think part of the problem we have in youth policy making is the gray graph there at the bottom. That's political parties, right? And it's also one of the state institutions that these surveys ask about is that have the highest amount of people across the entire age range, but also of young people saying they don't trust them at all. And the fact that political parties tend to do a new youth policy with every election cycle, and that we haven't managed to decouple youth policy making from election cycles enough, is one of the problems that we have, right? Because what very often youth policies say they want to do is strengthen young people's sense of belonging, strengthen their identity, strengthen their trust in politics. But then we find out in the surveys that we do, trust in politics, trust in democracy, trust in state institutions is hardly the problem. Trust in political parties, however, is. And that youth policy making is very often a proxy for rebuilding trust in political parties is one of the larger problems that we have to solve in our field. Now, and I want to then conclude with like 2 data points that bring it a little more closely to this year's theme of the Offenburg Talks, namely identity, sense of belonging. So there is one question: how proud are you of your own nationality? So this graph starts at 25, finishes at 55, right? Always look at the scale. It's on a screen like that. Sometimes helpful to keep the scale, the y-axis a little shorter so you can see the nuances between the age groups a little better. But you see largely the same development, proud of own nationality being at an all-time low really at the beginning of the 1990s and then gone a little bit through ups and downs, but largely has improved. And so you have between 46 and 43% of young people, depending on age group, who say, again, on a Likert scale with 4 responses, 3 of them positive, 1 fully negative, who say, we are very proud of our own nationality. Again, would be super interesting to look at that with people who live in the same country whose nationality they have, to look at this by gender, to look at this by urban rural, all of these things we haven't been able to do yet. And then a very awkward question in these surveys, but it does exist, is, are you willing to fight for your own country should the need arise? And not only did the question shock me, I mean, I worked with these surveys for a long time, but I've always somehow overlooked this question. In any case, so are you willing to fight for your own country? And it's only yes or no, so there's no Likert scale involved here, it's just yes or no. And so you see the yes responses here, and you see hardly any difference between the age groups. Scale goes from 50 to 100. So you see it hangs somewhere there between 70 and 80, but has largely been going down, right, since the fall of the wall in 1989 over this period, been going down quite considerably. And of course, I think we don't need to explain where the spike around the mid-90s comes from, right, with the context and history of a war in Europe at that time. And so then I think my last one is a question that's new, right? So they used to ask in these surveys around layers of identity, how much do you feel as a world citizen? How much do you feel as a citizen of your country, of your region, of your city, village, town? Now, they changed these questions in the last survey round after lots of discussions at global conferences, and it's been a process that's been dragged out for, I think, a decade and a half. And now the formulation that the research community has arrived at is, how close do you feel to, and then the world, your continent, in our case Europe, your country, your region, and then your village, town, city, right? And here you see, on a scale from 0 to 100, because I have a comparative graph a little later, you see the village and town is at the top of the feeling of closeness, then followed by the country, followed by the region, and then with quite a distance, the world and Europe, right? That's how young people respond to when being asked about it that way. How close do you feel? And this is very close. Again, was the Likert scale very close, close, not very close, and then not close at all. And this is then very close and close combined, so the two positive ones, right? And you see here country and village town then become almost identical and overlapping, followed by the region with a little bit of distance, and then followed by Europe, and then followed by the world. But what you see here is, I think, what we've also seen in a lot of contributions in the past days is that these don't really compete, right? More than 50% of young people, much more young people than are ever involved in European youth work, right? More than half of the young people in the 46 member states of the Council of Europe have no problem in having an identity that's shared between the world, Europe, the region in which they live, the city, town, village they live, the country in which they live. There's a hierarchy, but there's no real competition here. And so this question of what are conflicting identities, I think we also tend to look in the wrong direction in our day and time. We used to do a lot of work around constructing European citizenship and helping young people resolve the tension between, am I a European, or am I a German, or a Slovenian, or Croat, or Norwegian? The survey work that we have now in front of us suggests that this is less conflicted with tension than we thought it to be a decade or two ago, and that maybe the tensions, as we have seen in other presentations during the talks here, maybe have moved elsewhere, and that the attention of how youth work deals with tensions in identity and belonging also should move elsewhere. So I want to conclude with just two very broad insights that what we have learned in the past 3 weeks is very simply, we could know a lot more about youth identities if we wanted to. There's really a wealth of information there that in our field we tend to not work with, which is a shame. And also, we really could do a lot more for resolving some of the current modern tensions of our time around identity for and with young people as well. And with that, thank you very much.